now, can we talk a little bit about like the inconsistencies that you see? How have you seen that impact employee morale, engagement? What could HR do to potentially address this?
Yeah. It's interesting because societally, compensation was taboo for so long and you couldn't talk about it. And then all of a sudden, new generations are saying, but we want to be transparent about compensation. And now governments are saying you have to be transparent about compensation. If you're in a pay transparency state, you may not just have to put a job posting with a range. You might actually have to give every employee the range if they request it. Soon enough, employees are going to become wise enough to say, I want to know my range at any point in time. And if you don't have this, how are you going to disclose this? Now, all of a sudden, you might have litigation risk from an employee saying, you didn't disclose the range. I was probably outside of it. You probably underpaid me. I'm bringing in my lawyers. That is not productive for a business looking to grow or be profitable or achieve its goals. It's not dealing with these fires that you could have easily avoided if you were more transparent about it, or at the very least had a system in place. And that'll just mean a compensation tool. I mean, actually having what I would call your foundational pieces, have a compensation philosophy that guides how you see compensation, have a simple set of levels or a job architecture of these are the jobs we care about, and the compensation bands are on each. This is what we're willing to pay for each of these jobs. You can keep it simple and then expand and make it more sophisticated as you grow. But I think the impact of not having such a system in place, it can lead to broken trust. So employees just don't trust that you're giving me a fair compensation or a fair offer, even if you are. And I think the other reason why this happens is because, 40 years ago, employees didn't have access to any data. They had no idea what the market rate was for something. Today, you can Google your way and find a bunch of free sources, whether it's Glassdoor or salary.com. You can find these job postings. And so now I come to the table as the employee against the company. And there's this tension because I can say, hey, here I have my data. Unless you show me yours, I'm not trusting that you're being fully trustworthy. That's not the relationship you want to have with your employees. And broken trust can lead to not only dissatisfaction, but employee attrition. And I don't think that people really realize how expensive attrition really is. Like, take an example.
So expensive.
You have a team of 10 engineers or 10 salespeople. You lose one person. Your productivity goes down not just because that person isn't producing. It also goes down because the remaining 9 need to help with the recruitment process, which doesn't just happen overnight. It probably takes you at least a month to hire a backfill. And that backfill, the day they start, they are not productive. It takes them time to ramp up. You might have hired that person who is coming at you more expensively than what the existing incumbent employee was asking for in a raise, and they're not going to be productive for months at a time. So if it's a salesperson, that is hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially of lost revenue from that single person, plus tens of thousands or more for each individual that was involved in the recruitment process or the onboarding process. And so when you actually quantify what the cost of attrition is, you realize it's so much more expensive than actually having a program in place to pay people fairly, communicate that you're paying people fairly, and when they can expect additional raises. Because if you don't have this like date in mind of, oh, I know I get raises in June and promotions happen also in September, then all of a sudden you have this, induced stress and uncertainty of, does the company even care about me, want to give me a raise? Maybe they don't. Let me take that recruiting call. And all of a sudden you fall in love with the new company, you leave. All of this can really be addressed if you just have a program in place and you're more transparent about it. And I'm very excited that pay transparency laws are forcing companies to be more but we'll see whether companies adopt, the laws in good faith and actually use this to their advantage, or if they just treat it as a compliance checkbox, because I think that's going to lead to more harm than actual benefit for companies.
Yeah. And I've heard a lot of CEOs already say like, well, no one's going to ever sue me for this. They're not going to be able to ever enforce these pay transparency laws. Okay. I've heard multiple CEOs say that.
Yeah. I will take the other side of that bet.
That's not the point of the laws too, right? Like the point is to not do shitty things. I do think something really interesting would be if like HR, like, you have to sign a handbook potentially every year. Sometimes you sign it like once. A lot of SOC 2 guidelines are changing where you have to potentially sign it every year. You have to re-sign your employee handbook. I almost wish there was like a compensation philosophy piece where it's like every year the employee just like signs like, I understand that my comp will be reviewed at least once a year and I can expect an adjustment if I'm eligible for it once a year. Like just setting the guidelines at the very front, or even putting it in your employee handbook, because the trust issue is very real. And like HR already is not trusted by the average person. So if I ran up to the average person on the street and said, do you trust your HR team? I bet the average person would say no.
Yeah. And I would say if you ask the average person would tell you they feel they're underpaid, even when they're
always.
overpaid. Yeah. It's probably very close to 100%. And I think a lot of times it's because they just don't know any better. They don't know the system. They don't know when raises occur. They don't realize what level they are in the organization. So of course, I want to feel like I'm underpaid, because you always have the belief in yourself that you're worth more. And there's something that's, I think very natural for people to feel of, I'm delivering so much value because I only have my own perspective and I'm not paid enough to do this thing. Even if you're actually paid way too much for that thing you're doing at work.
If I had $1 for every time an employee told me they felt like they were underpaid, I would not need to be working anymore. Like everyone thinks they're underpaid. I could just retire. But it's interesting because there's this like that misconception. And then you see employees like make decisions based on their pay and that they want to leave. But also, I think like for so long, there's been this like shame associated with talking about money. Yeah. And HR has almost benefited from that like cultural taboo that we don't talk about money. And it's an uncomfortable thing to tell your friends how much money you make. But I keep telling people, like, I will ask all my friends how much money they make. I will ask anybody. And I have no shame about it, because then I can either say, hey, I think you're a little bit underpaid, as somebody who sees a lot of data, or as their friend, then I have comprehension for like what my role would command in the market. Totally. And that's like I talk to HR leaders all the time, like, well, how much is your pay? Well, what level are you at? Like, let's talk about it. And then I share my pay as well openly, because I'm like, I have nothing to lose. And I'm helping HR people understand that if we demystify this and get more comfortable talking about pay, it only benefits us in the long haul.
Yeah, I agree. The one thing I would caveat there, or not necessarily caveat, but encourage people to consider is it isn't just salary. You should consider everything else, because I've seen many times where people have said, I got a $10,000 raise, so I'm going to that company. And I'm like, okay, but what about commissions or bonuses, benefits, equity? And then you realize after the fact, oh shit, they actually left tens of thousands per year at this past company for a $10,000 raise. And when you actually consider, you're like, well, you're actually paying so much more for your healthcare benefits that $10,000 after tax and after the benefits you're paying to just be equal, it's actually more like $2,000 a year, which is literally less than $200 a month. Like, is that really big enough reason for you to leave the company that hopefully you loved and were really inspired in, because you had the illusion of $10,000 more as a salary was enough to make up for? And it actually isn't a lot of times.
It isn't.
A lot of times companies do underpay, and it's not a $10,000 gap. It's actually like $50,000. And especially if you include other forms. But I would definitely encourage people to consider the whole package, the total rewards package, not just salary.